The
What
morning
in the
sun cast
blazes
long
is
shadows
that?
across Fort Campbell as military officials in
I've
pressed
never seen
uniforms
anything
gathered
like
for
it.
what should have been a routine demonstration. The MX-7 Phantom tank, sleek and imposing, represented billions in defense spending and years of cutting-edge engineering. General Harold Mitchell stood with his arms crossed, flanked by representatives from Congress and the Department of Defense. This was to be the crowning achievement of his 40-year military career. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Dr. Ryan Phillips, the project's lead engineer, his voice carrying across the testing grounds. "What you are about to witness is the future of American military dominance. The MX-7 Phantom hybrid engine system reduces heat signatures by 80% and noise levels by 65%, making it virtually undetectable on the modern battlefield." The assembled crowd nodded appreciatively as the massive machine roared to life. The initial demonstration proceeded flawlessly. The tank executed precise maneuvers, its engine purring with surprising quietness for such a powerful machine. Dr. Phillips smiled confidently at General Mitchell, who gave an approving nod in return. 15 minutes into the demonstration, a subtle change occurred. Only the most experienced ears could detect it. At first, a slight fluctuation in the engine's rhythm, a barely perceptible vibration. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died. The massive tank sat motionless on the testing field, an embarrassing monument to technological failure. Dr. Phillips rushed forward, his face flushed. He conferred hastily with his team of engineers, all young men and women with advanced degrees from prestigious universities. After several minutes of animated discussion, he turned to face the increasingly restless crowd of military officials. "We're experiencing a temporary setback," he announced, forcing confidence into his voice. "These things happen with prototype systems. We'll need approximately 72 hours to diagnose and correct the issue." "Is this some kind of joke?" The voice came from the back of the crowd. Heads turned to see an elderly man standing alone. He wore faded jeans and a worn plaid shirt with frayed cuffs. His weathered face spoke of decades under the sun, and he leaned slightly on his right leg, favoring it in a way that suggested an old injury. Despite his unimposing appearance, something in his steady gaze commanded attention. A security officer moved toward him. "Sir, this is a restricted demonstration. I'll need to see your credentials." The old man didn't acknowledge the security officer. His eyes remained fixed on the tank and the cluster of engineers surrounding it. Dr. Phillips straightened his posture, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Excuse me, but who are you?" "Name's Thomas Walker, Tom to most folks who know me." "Well, Mr. Walker, this is a classified military demonstration. Unless you have proper clearance. That tank of yours has a micro-vibrational dissonance in the mounting system." Tom interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "It'll fail every time once the hybrid system reaches operating temperature." One of the younger engineers snickered. "Old man, this is advanced technology, not some John Deere tractor you're used to fixing." The comment drew smiles from several others on the engineering team, but Tom's expression didn't change. He took a step forward, and something in his bearing made the security officer hesitate to stop him. "Son, I was designing hybrid propulsion systems when you were still learning your multiplication tables." Tom said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the young engineer. General Mitchell stepped forward, studying Tom with narrowed eyes. "Let him approach." Dr. Phillips began to protest, but the general held up a hand to silence him. As Tom walked toward the tank, the crowd parted, watching with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. What happened next would change not just the fate of a billion-dollar project, but how everyone present would come to understand the true value of a human being. Tom stood before the massive machine, looking suddenly small and frail beside it. He reached out and placed a hand on the still, warm metal of the engine housing, closing his eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only he could hear. When he opened them again, there was a flicker of sadness in his gaze. "I don't just know what's wrong with it," he said quietly, looking directly at General Mitchell. "I designed the original prototype for this system 40 years ago." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas Walker had not always been an old man with calloused hands and a slight limp. In the summer of 1953, he was a 19-year-old private in the 2nd Infantry Division, stationed near the 38th parallel during the final months of the Korean War. Unlike most of his fellow soldiers, Tom hadn't joined the Army out of patriotic fervor or draft necessity. He'd enlisted because machines made more sense to him than people ever had. Orphaned at 7 when his parents died in a factory accident, Tom had grown up shuffling between foster homes across Ohio. He spent his childhood taking apart anything mechanical he could get his hands on. Clocks, radios, car engines, just to put them back together again. By 12, he had repaired the orphanage's rusted laundry room hydraulics on his own, a feat that impressed everyone except the administrators who punished him for tampering with equipment. In the Army, Tom found his place as a maintenance specialist for the division's vehicles. While others struggled with the complex mechanical systems, Tom seemed to have an almost supernatural connection with machines. He could diagnose problems that stumped more experienced mechanics often by simply listening to an engine or feeling the vibrations through his fingertips. "That kid's got golden ears," his commanding officer would say. "Walker can hear a failing bearing before the metal even knows it's going bad." Captain James Jimmy Mitchell took a special interest in the quiet young mechanic. Unlike many officers who viewed enlisted men as interchangeable parts in the military machine, Captain Mitchell recognized exceptional talent when he saw it. He made it his personal mission to mentor Tom, ensuring his skills were put to proper use rather than wasted on routine maintenance tasks. "You've got a gift, Walker," Mitchell told him one evening as they worked late repairing a damaged M46 Patton tank. "The way you understand these machines, it's like you speak their language." Tom had shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "They talk to you if you listen, sir. Every sound, every vibration, it's all part of the conversation." Mitchell had smiled and handed Tom his own personal Timex wristwatch. "My father gave me this when I enlisted. Said a soldier needs to hear the call of time." He pointed to the watch face. "Now I'm giving it to you because you hear things the rest of us miss." Tom had tried to refuse the gift, but Mitchell insisted. "Keep it. Someday it might remind you of what's important." The watch was on Tom's wrist 3 months later during the brutal battle at Porkchop Hill. Their unit had advanced into heavily contested territory when enemy artillery fire disabled their lead tank. With the crew injured and the vehicle immobilized in exposed terrain, they became an easy target for enemy fire. Without transportation, the wounded men inside would certainly die. While others sought cover, Tom ran toward the disabled tank, diving beneath it as shells exploded nearby. Working by touch in the darkness underneath the massive vehicle, he identified a severed fuel line and damaged ignition system. Using his belt, a canteen, and spare parts from his kit, he performed a field repair that military engineers would later study as a textbook example of improvisation under fire. The tank roared back to life just as enemy forces began to advance. Tom helped load the wounded, including a young Private William Anderson, who had been hit by shrapnel while providing covering fire. As they retreated to safety, Anderson gripped Tom's arm with surprising strength. "I won't forget this," he'd said, blood seeping through his field bandages. "If I live, I'll repay you someday. That's a promise." Tom had simply nodded, already focused on keeping the tank running until they reached the medical station. He never expected to see Private Anderson again, much less have the man make good on his battlefield promise. For his actions that day, Tom received the Purple Heart and Silver Star. The injuries to his right leg would trouble him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of both his courage and his mortality. But it was his reputation as a mechanical genius that would define his military career. When he finally left active service as a captain in 1962, the Army immediately hired him as a civilian contractor specializing in advanced propulsion systems. By 1982, Tom Walker had become one of the Pentagon's most valuable assets, though few outside his immediate colleagues knew his name. His work on Project Phoenix, the military's first serious attempt at developing hybrid propulsion technology for combat vehicles, was classified at the highest levels. The goal was revolutionary: create engines that generated less heat and noise, making vehicles harder to detect on the battlefield. The demonstration on that fateful day in March 1982 should have been Tom's crowning achievement. After years of research and development, his team had created a prototype that performed beyond expectations in initial testing. Military observers and representatives from Westland Technologies, the defense contractor partnering on the project, gathered to witness what promised to be a historic breakthrough. Tom noticed the problem immediately during the pre-demonstration inspection: a subtle incompatibility between the cooling system and the operating temperature of the hybrid engine. He documented his concerns and recommended postponing the demonstration until modifications could be made. "The system works fine in controlled conditions," he explained to the project manager. But under full operational stress, the cooling system won't compensate for thermal expansion. It could lead to catastrophic failure. His warnings were dismissed. The young MIT graduates on his team, eager to impress the Wesleyan executives, insisted their calculations were perfect. The project manager, under pressure to show results, sided with them. "We've checked everything, Walker," he said. "The cooling system is within specifications. Your concerns are noted, but we are proceeding." The explosion 30 minutes into the demonstration injured 3 people, including Sarah Winters, the only female electrical engineer on the team. Tom had rushed into the smoke-filled testing chamber to pull her to safety when a secondary explosion sent metal fragments tearing through his right leg, reopening his old war wound and adding new damage that would never fully heal. The official investigation that followed should have vindicated Tom. The technical reports clearly showed that the failure occurred exactly as he had predicted. But defense contracts worth billions hung in the balance, and Westland Technologies needed someone to blame. Tom, with his lack of formal education and unconventional methods, became the perfect scapegoat. Walker violated safety protocols, the final report stated. His unauthorized modifications to the standard testing procedures directly contributed to the system failure. It was a lie, but a convenient one. Tom was removed from the project, his security clearance reduced. Though he wasn't officially fired, he was reassigned to routine maintenance oversight, a devastating demotion for a man who had once designed systems that changed military capabilities. The professional humiliation was only the beginning. Medical bills from his injuries mounted as he underwent multiple surgeries. The promising career he had built crumbled around him. His wife Elizabeth, who had stood by him through war and countless military reassignments, finally reached her breaking point 2 years after the accident. "I can't do this anymore, Tom," she had said, suitcases already packed by the door. "I can't live with a man who's always living in the past, fighting battles that ended years ago." "I'm fighting for the truth," he had replied, leaning heavily on his cane. "The truth won't pay our debts," she had answered, "and it won't bring back the man I married." She left that evening, and the divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later. The house they had bought together went on the market to pay his mounting medical bills. By 1908, Captain Thomas Walker, once one of the military's most brilliant minds, was all but forgotten by the institution he had served faithfully for decades. 40 years passed. The world changed in ways both profound and trivial. Wars ended and new ones began. Technology advanced at a pace that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. And Thomas Walker grew old, his brilliant mind still sharp, but housed in a body that reminded him daily of its fragility. At 78, Tom lived alone in a converted storage shed behind an abandoned repair shop in rural Arizona. The modest space suited his needs and his limited income, a military pension that barely covered essentials. To supplement his finances, he worked as a mechanic for local farms, fixing tractors and agricultural equipment with tools nearly as old as he was. Every morning followed the same ritual. He woke at 5, brewed black coffee in a dented percolator, and read a physical newspaper, while the world around him increasingly consumed its information through digital screens. The ancient Timex watch that Captain Mitchell had given him decades ago still adorned his wrist, keeping remarkably accurate time despite its age, much like Tom himself. On this particular morning, Tom was adjusting the hydraulic cylinder on a John Deere 5E series tractor when he heard the sound of tires on the dirt road leading to the farm. Few visitors came this way, and fewer still would have any interest in finding him. He continued working, assuming the approaching vehicle was headed elsewhere. But the black SUV pulled directly into the barnyard, dust billowing around it as it came to a stop. Tom straightened slowly, wincing at the familiar pain in his right leg. He wiped his hands on a rag as a woman in her mid-30s emerged from the vehicle. She wore civilian-clothes jeans and a simple blouse, but Tom recognized military bearing when he saw it. The way she surveyed her surroundings, the precision in her movements, this woman had served. She approached with purpose, extending her hand. "Mr. Walker, I'm Lieutenant Lisa Mitchell." Tom froze, the name hitting him like a physical blow. "Mitchell?" She nodded. "James Mitchell was my grandfather. He told me stories about you my entire childhood." "Jimmy's granddaughter," Tom said softly, shaking her hand. "He made it home then, had a family." "He did. He passed away 5 years ago. Lung cancer." Her expression softened. "His last coherent words were about you." He made me promise to find you if I ever needed someone who could hear what others couldn't. Tom studied her face, seeing shadows of his old friend in her eyes and jawline. And do you need such a person, Lieutenant? It's not me who needs you, Mr. Walker. It's the United States Army. She glanced toward her vehicle. I work for the Department of Defense now, overseeing special projects. One in particular is in serious trouble. The military has plenty of engineers, young ones with degrees and computers. They don't need an old man with a toolbox. That's where you're wrong. Lisa's expression grew intense. They're using your design, Mr. Walker. The MX-7 Phantom hybrid propulsion system is built on principles you developed 40 years ago. But no one knows that they're just following blueprints without understanding the genius behind them. Tom's expression remained neutral, but his heart rate increased. For 40 years, he had tried to forget the humiliation, the injustice. He had built a simple life far from the world that had discarded him. And now that world was calling him back. Why would I help them? He asked, his voice steady, despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Because soldiers' lives depend on it, Lisa answered simply. And because my grandfather said you were the most honorable man he ever knew. He said you never stopped listening, even when no one was listening to you. Tom turned away ostensibly to put down his tools, but really to hide the effect her words had on him. Honor. It was a concept he had built his life around until life taught him how little it mattered in the face of political expediency and corporate profits. And yet the words still resonated within him. He looked at the ancient Timex on his wrist. Hear the call of time, he murmured, running his thumb over the scratched face. Sir. Nothing. Tom turned back to her. This project of yours, what exactly is wrong with it? The MX-7 Phantom tank, state-of-the-art hybrid engine system. It works perfectly in testing but fails after approximately 15 minutes of operation under full combat conditions. 3 engineering teams have examined it. None of them can figure out why. Tom nodded slowly. And now there's a demonstration scheduled for the brass, and your engineers are scrambling because they can't fix it in time. Lisa looked surprised. How did you know about the demonstration? Because that's how the military works, has for centuries. Tom allowed himself a small smile. When does this demonstration happen? Tomorrow morning at Fort Campbell. General William Anderson will be there. Tom's hand froze on the wrench he was cleaning. William Anderson. Yes, 4-star general approaching retirement. This project is something of a legacy for him. Why do you know him? We met long ago. Tom's mind raced back to Porkchop Hill, to a wounded young private gripping his arm, making a promise. He survived then. Sir. Tom shook his head. It doesn't matter. He looked around at the quiet farm, the simple life he had built from the ruins of his former career. Part of him wanted to refuse to send this young woman back to the Pentagon with his regrets. Let them solve their own problems. Let them face the consequences of forgetting. But another part, the part that still woke at Phoebe and read physical newspapers and kept an old Timex ticking, that part knew he would go. Not for recognition, not for vindication, but because somewhere out there a machine was failing and he could hear its call. I'll need to finish this hydraulic system first, he said, turning back to the tractor. Farmer Jennings needs it for tomorrow's work. Well, Lisa nodded, understanding that this was his way of agreeing. I can wait. The next morning, Tom found himself passing through the gates of Fort Campbell, a place he had never visited before, but which felt eerily familiar. Military bases had a certain sameness to them, a continuity across decades that was both comforting and disconcerting. He sat in the passenger seat of Lisa's SUV, his old toolbox resting on his lap like a talisman from another era. The young guard at the checkpoint examined his ancient military ID with obvious skepticism. This expired in 1985, sir. So did my patience, Tom replied evenly. Lisa intervened, presenting her credentials and making a brief call. The guard's demeanor changed immediately. Whoever was on the other end of that call had serious authority. They were waved through without further questions. As they drove toward the testing grounds, Tom gazed out at the modern military infrastructure, so different from the bases he had known, yet serving the same essential purpose. Young soldiers in current uniforms moved with the same purposeful stride he remembered from his own youth. Some things never changed despite the passage of time. They don't know you're coming, Lisa said as they parked. Dr. Phillips, the project director, he thinks he has 72 hours to solve the problem. And what do you think will happen when an old man with a limp and a rusty toolbox shows up uninvited? Lisa glanced at him, her expression serious. I think they'll dismiss you immediately until you prove them wrong. Tom nodded, appreciating her honesty. Your grandfather had the same directness. Best compliment you could give me, sir. She hesitated, then added, whatever happens in there, thank you for coming. It would have meant everything to him to know you're here. Tom didn't reply, but he tightened his grip slightly on the old toolbox as they walked toward the demonstration area where military officials had reassembled after yesterday's failure. His steps were measured, his limp more pronounced after the long drive, but his back remained straight, military bearing ingrained so deeply that even decades of civilian life couldn't erase it. They arrived just as Dr. Phillips was explaining the delay to the assembled officials. The young engineer's confidence seemed forced, his gestures too expansive, his promises too emphatic. Tom recognized the signs of a man buying time, hoping a solution would present itself before his career imploded. And then Tom saw him, General William Anderson. Despite the decades that had passed, Tom recognized the eyes of the young private he had pulled from a burning tank on Porkchop Hill. The general stood tall and distinguished, his chest adorned with the medals earned over a lifetime of service. Did he remember the mechanic who had saved him? Would he recognize Tom after all these years? Before he could ponder this further, Tom heard Dr. Phillips make his pronouncement about needing 72 hours to diagnose the problem. The words escaped his lips before he could reconsider. Is this some kind of joke? All eyes turned toward him. Tom could feel their judgment, an old man in worn clothes presuming to question experts with advanced degrees. The security officer approached, and the young engineer mocked him, but Tom focused on the machine before him. The tank called to him across the decades, a mechanical descendant of systems he had once breathed life into. As he placed his hand on the warm metal housing, memories flooded back, not just of the explosion that had derailed his life, but of the countless hours spent designing, testing, listening to the subtle language of mechanical systems that few others could hear. In that moment, Tom Walker was no longer an aging mechanic from rural Arizona. He was once again Captain Walker, one of the finest minds the Army Corps of Engineers had ever produced. And he knew exactly what was wrong with the tank. The morning sunlight glinted off the MX-7 Phantom's sleek armor as Thomas Walker stood before the gathering of military officials and engineers. The silence that had fallen after his proclamation stretched uncomfortably. General Mitchell was the first to recover, stepping forward with narrowed eyes. Escort him to the engine bay, he ordered, his authoritative voice breaking the tension. Dr. Phillips began to protest, his face flushing with indignation. General, with all due respect, we have a team of qualified engineers working on this issue. We don't need interference from... That wasn't a suggestion, Doctor. The general's tone left no room for argument. Tom followed a reluctant Dr. Phillips toward the massive hangar where the tank's duplicate engine system lay exposed on specialized mounting brackets surrounded by diagnostic equipment worth millions. Young engineers in pristine lab coats looked up from their tablets and laptops as the unusual procession entered the elderly man with his weathered toolbox, an anomaly in their high-tech sanctuary. Team, this is Mr. Walker, Dr. Phillips announced with poorly concealed disdain. Apparently he has some insights into our engineering challenge. The introduction drew subtle smirks from several team members. A young woman with an MIT sweatshirt whispered something to her colleague, who failed to suppress a chuckle. Mr. Walker claims to have designed the original prototype for this system. Dr. Phillips continued, emphasizing the word claims in a way that made his skepticism clear. Not claims, Tom corrected quietly. I did design it. Project Phoenix, 1982. A tall engineer with rimless glasses stepped forward. Project Phoenix, that's classified information. How would you know about that? Because I ran it, son. Tom set down his toolbox and surveyed the engine before him. Despite 4 decades of technological evolution, he could see the echoes of his original design, the foundational architecture that had survived generations of modifications and improvements. Some things change, others stay the same. Dr. Phillips crossed his arms. Well, since you're so familiar with the system, perhaps you'd care to share your diagnosis with the team. Tom ignored the sarcasm, his focus already on the engine. He ran his hand along the housing, feeling the residual heat from the previous day's failed demonstration. His fingers traced the contours of the mounting system, pausing at key connection points. Finally, he reached into his toolbox and pulled out an object that caused several engineers to exchange incredulous glances, a mechanical stethoscope, a simple tool that had been largely replaced by electronic diagnostics decades ago. "Is that what I think it is?" asked a young engineer with a neatly trimmed beard. "Depends on what you think it is," Tom replied, placing the stethoscope against various points on the engine block. "We have a multi-million-dollar diagnostic system that can measure variances down to the micron," Dr. Phillips said, gesturing to the array of computers and sensors surrounding the engine. "Yet you're using a tool from the Korean War era." Tom continued his methodical examination, seemingly oblivious to the growing impatience around him. "Sometimes the old ways work best." For 20 minutes, Tom worked in silence, testing connections, listening to subtle sounds, feeling for vibrations that the engineer's instruments might miss. The team watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that gradually shifted toward grudging respect as they observed his systematic approach. Finally, Tom straightened, wincing slightly as his right leg protested the movement. He stood before the engine, his weathered face contemplative. "Did you find something?" Dr. Phillips asked, unable to keep the condescension from his voice despite a flicker of genuine curiosity. Tom closed his toolbox and turned to face the assembled engineers. "The problem isn't in the engine." "What do you mean?" Dr. Phillips frowned. "It's in the system integration. There's a micro vibration in the mounting base that only shows up once the engine heats up and expands. That thermally induced microvibration creates harmonic dissonance, throwing off the sync between the combustion engine and the electric drive." The engineers exchanged glances. Dr. Phillips laughed softly, though it sounded forced. "Mr. Walker, with all due respect, that's not possible. We've tested all the mounting bases." "Did you test them at room temperature?" Tom asked quietly. The silence that followed was answer enough. "Did you check the vibration dampers after 15 minutes at full operating temperature?" The female engineer with the MIT sweatshirt consulted her tablet. "The dampers are within factory specifications." Factory specs were made for conventional engines. Tom explained, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about the technical aspects he understood so intimately. "This hybrid system generates a different vibration pattern. The failure only happens after the system heats up to 182 degrees Fahrenheit. It's easily missed by static or cold diagnostics." Dr. Phillips folded his arms. "Mr. Walker, that sounds like guesswork. We need concrete data." Tom nodded slowly, picked up his toolbox, and started walking toward the exit. "Where are you going?" Lisa Mitchell called after him, confusion evident in her voice. "You don't need me," Tom said without turning around. "You already know more than I do." Tom left the hangar without rushing, his silhouette leaning slightly to the right from the old injury. Behind him, the three engineers stood in awkward silence, watching him go. Lisa hesitated, torn between following Tom and staying to see the engineer's reaction. "Well, Dr. Phillips said," finally clearing his throat, "that was certainly interesting." "Should we run the test he suggested?" asked the female engineer, her earlier mockery replaced by uncertainty. Dr. Phillips waved dismissively. "We have our own diagnostic protocols. Let's not waste time on wild theories from unqualified sources." Outside in the parking lot, Tom sat in Lisa's SUV, his hands resting on his old toolbox. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the military base. He wasn't angry that emotion had burned out of him long ago. What he felt was a familiar weariness, the burden of being the man everyone underestimated until they needed him, and even then they preferred not to believe. Lisa slid into the driver's seat beside him. "That's it, you're giving up." Tom looked at her, seeing shadows of his old friend Jimmy in her determined expression. "I didn't give up. I told them what's wrong. Whether they listen is their choice. My grandfather said you were stubborn, but he never said you'd walk away from a fight." Tom's weathered hand moved unconsciously to the Timex watch on his wrist. "Your grandfather knew me in a different life, Lieutenant. Back when I thought the truth would always prevail if you just fought hard enough for it." Lisa studied him for a long moment. "What happened in 1982, the real story, not the official record?" Tom turned to look out the window, his gaze distant as he traveled back through the decades. The memories of Project Phoenix remain vivid despite the passage of time. The excitement of innovation, the camaraderie of his team, the pride in creating something revolutionary. "We were developing the military's first truly viable hybrid propulsion system," he began. designed to reduce heat signatures and acoustic profiles while maintaining combat performance. It was decades ahead of anything else in development. He described the original team brilliant minds from diverse backgrounds. There was Colonel Matthews, the project supervisor, who shielded them from Pentagon politics. Sarah Winters, the electrical engineer who pioneered the power distribution system. James Harper, the combustion specialist, whose innovations made the impossible possible. We weren't just colleagues, Tom said softly. We were family, united by a common vision. Then came the breakthrough. After months of failures and setbacks. The system finally achieved stable operation in laboratory conditions. The demonstration was scheduled. Representatives from Westland Technologies invited to witness what promised to be a historic achievement. I found the flaw during the final inspection, Tom continued. The cooling system couldn't compensate for thermal expansion under sustained operation. I documented everything, recommended postponing the demonstration. But they went ahead anyway, Lisa surmised. Tom nodded. The young MIT graduates on the team insisted their calculations were perfect. The project manager was under pressure to show results. His voice grew quieter. 30 minutes into the demonstration, the primary cooling line ruptured. The explosion injured 3 people. He described running into the smoke-filled testing chamber, finding Sarah Winters unconscious near the damaged equipment. As he dragged her to safety, a secondary explosion sent metal fragments tearing through his right leg. The technical investigation confirmed exactly what I'd warned about, Tom said. But by then, politics had taken over. Westland Technologies had billions in contracts at stake. They needed a scapegoat. So they blamed you, Lisa finished. The official report claimed I violated safety protocols, said my unauthorized modifications caused the failure. Tom's expression remained neutral, but decades-old bitterness crept into his voice. My security clearance was downgraded. I was reassigned to equipment maintenance oversight. They buried you, Lisa said, along with my designs. Tom gestured toward the hangar they had just left. Now they're building systems based on my work, but they don't understand the underlying principles. They follow blueprints without grasping the philosophy behind them. Lisa was quiet for a moment, processing this information. What happened to the others? Your team. Colonel Matthews retired the next year. James Harper took a position with NASA, and Sarah, Tom's voice softened. Sarah suffered spinal injuries in the explosion. Last I heard, she was teaching at a community college in Maryland. And your family? Tom's hand tightened imperceptibly on the toolbox. Elizabeth left 2 years after the accident. The medical bills, the demotion, the bitterness. It was too much. I don't blame her. They sat in silence as the weight of Tom's story settled between them. Finally, Lisa turned the key in the ignition. Where are we going? Tom asked. To get lunch, she replied. This isn't over yet. At a small diner just outside the base, Tom and Lisa sat in a corner booth, largely ignored by the lunchtime crowd of soldiers and civilian contractors. Tom picked at a club sandwich while Lisa made several phone calls, speaking too quietly for him to overhear. When she finally set her phone down, her expression had shifted from frustration to determination. Tell me about the micro vibration again, she said, in terms a non-engineer can understand. Tom set down his sandwich and thought for a moment. Imagine playing a violin. When you draw the bow across the strings, you create vibration at a specific frequency. That's the note you hear. Now imagine trying to play that violin while riding in a car on a bumpy road. The car's vibrations interfere with the string vibrations, distorting the sound. He took a sip of water before continuing. In our hybrid system, the combustion engine and electric motor need to operate in perfect harmony, like musicians in a duet. The mounting system is supposed to isolate them from external vibrations, like shock absorbers in a car. But something's interfering with that isolation, Lisa prompted. Exactly. When the engine heats up, metal expands. Different components expand at different rates. This creates subtle stresses in the mounting system. The vibration dampers were designed for conventional engines, not hybrid systems with dual vibration patterns. Once the system reaches full operating temperature, these micro vibrations create harmonic interference between the combustion and electric systems. Lisa nodded, comprehension dawning. And the computer tries to compensate but can't because it's receiving conflicting signals. Precisely. Tom smiled, slightly impressed by her quick understanding. The diagnostic systems keep showing all components are within specifications, Because individually they are. It's the interaction that's the problem. And this is what you warned about in 1982. Tom's smile faded. Different system, similar principle. Thermal expansion, creating unanticipated stress points. Basic engineering, but easy to miss if you're focused only on the sophisticated components and not the humble connections between them. Lisa's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She checked it, then looked up at Tom with renewed purpose. Finish your sandwich, Mr. Walker. We're going back to base. Why they made their opinion of me quite clear. Lisa smiled, a determined glint in her eyes that reminded Tom forcefully of her grandfather. Because while you were explaining violin analogies to me, Dr. Phillips and his team decided to run the tests you suggested. And guess what they found? Tom's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark of the engineer he had once been, the man whose innovations had changed military technology forever. They found micro vibrations in the mounting base, Lisa continued, exactly as you described. They only appear when the system reaches 180 degrees Fahrenheit. The drive back to Fort Campbell passed in contemplative silence. Tom gazed out the window, watching the landscape roll by, so different from the world he had known as a young man, yet fundamentally unchanged in its essentials. People still lived, worked, hoped, and dreamed beneath the same skyline. Machines still followed the immutable laws of physics, regardless of how sophisticated their design became. As they approached the main gate, Tom straightened in his seat, a lifetime of military bearing asserting itself unconsciously. The guard waved them through with considerably more respect than during their morning arrival, suggesting word had spread about the elderly visitor's insights. They drove directly to the hangar, where the atmosphere had transformed dramatically. The earlier smugness and dismissal had been replaced by focused intensity as engineers huddled around computer screens displaying vibration analysis data. Dr. Phillips looked up as they entered, his expression a complex mixture of embarrassment, respect, and lingering pride. He approached Tom with an extended hand. Mr. Walker, he began, his tone markedly different from their earlier encounter. I owe you an apology. We tested the mounting base after prolonged heat exposure and found the micro vibration pattern exactly as you described. Tom accepted the handshake but remained silent, waiting for the younger man to continue. What I don't understand, Dr. Phillips admitted, is how you identified it so quickly with nothing but that ancient stethoscope in your hands. Our sensors didn't detect it until we specifically recalibrated them to look for thermal-induced oscillation patterns. Experience, Tom replied simply. When you've listened to engines for 60 years, you develop an ear for what sounds right and what doesn't. The machine tells you what's wrong if you know how to listen. The female engineer approached, her earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity. Mr. Walker, we found something else while reviewing the historical design documentation. The original mounting dampener specifications include a footnote about thermal compensation adjustments that none of us had implemented. The reference attributes it to something called the Walker principle. Tom's expression remained impassive, but Lisa noticed his hand move unconsciously to the old Timex on his wrist. The Walker principle, Dr. Phillips added, is taught at MIT and Caltech as a foundational concept in hybrid propulsion engineering. It states that in dual-mode propulsion systems, harmonic interference must be managed across the thermal spectrum, not just at optimal operating temperature. He looked at Tom with new understanding. We all learned it in school. None of us realized it was named after a person after you. Tom absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally a complex wave of emotions washed through him. For decades, he had lived with the knowledge that his work had been stolen, his reputation destroyed. Now he discovered that his name had lived on, after all, transformed into an abstract principle, divorced from the man who had developed it through years of dedication and insight. Before he could respond, a staff sergeant hurried into the hangar. Dr. Phillips, General Anderson would like to speak with Mr. Walker immediately. The walk to General Anderson's office passed in a blur of memories for Tom. 40 years melted away as he moved through the corridors of military power, his mind flashing back to Pentagon briefings, classified presentations, the world he had once navigated with confidence before his fall from grace. Lisa walked beside him, occasionally glancing at his profile with concern. Are you all right? Fine, Tom replied, though the single word carried a lifetime of emotional weight. The general's aide ushered them directly into a spacious office overlooking the base. Behind an imposing desk sat General William Anderson, four-star general and one of the most powerful men in the American military. At 85, his face showed the inevitable marks of age, yet he carried himself with the unbending authority of a lifetime in command. As Tom entered, the general stood, his eyes fixed on the older man with an intensity that transcended the usual military formality. "Leave us," Anderson instructed his aide and Dr. Phillips. He looked at Lisa. "Lieutenant Mitchell, you may stay." When the door closed, leaving the three of them alone, Anderson stepped around his desk and approached Tom. For a long moment, the two men regarded each other in silence, living testaments to how differently life can unfold from the same starting point. "Sergeant Walker," Anderson said, finally using Tom's old rank rather than his final captain's commission. "It's been a long time." 65 years, General," Tom replied, his voice steady. "Pork Chop Hill." Anderson nodded slowly. "I've wondered many times if you remembered me. I was just a scared kid with shrapnel in my leg, one of dozens you must have helped during your service." "I remember all of them," Tom said simply. The general gestured toward comfortable chairs arranged around a small conference table. "Please sit. That leg must be bothering you after standing in the hangar all morning." Tom lowered himself into a chair, concealing the relief of taking weight off his painful right leg. Lisa sat beside him, watching the interaction with fascination. "Lieutenant Mitchell tells me you diagnosed our engine problem in 20 minutes, Anderson said, "a problem that has stumped our best engineers for weeks." "The solution was always there in the original design specifications," Tom replied. "Your engineers just didn't understand what they were reading." Anderson smiled slightly. "The Walker principle. I've heard it referenced in briefings for years without making the connection." His expression grew more serious. "I've had the records from Project Phoenix pulled from the archives, Wafton. The real records, not the sanitized version Westland Technologies submitted to the Pentagon." Tom's hands tightened imperceptibly on the armrests of his chair. "Those records were classified." "I have the clearance," Anderson replied, "and the motivation. I've spent the last several hours reading about a shameful episode in our military's treatment of one of its most valuable assets." He leaned forward. "They buried you, Captain. They took your work, dismissed your warnings, and then blamed you when disaster struck exactly as you'd predicted." The office fell silent as the weight of this acknowledgement hung in the air. After 40 years of living with the injustice, hearing it recognized by a high-ranking official left Tom momentarily speechless. "Why now?" he asked finally. "Why after all this time?" Anderson's gaze was steady. "Because I made a promise on Pork Chop Hill, a promise I failed to keep until today." He reached into his desk drawer and removed a folder stamped with security classifications. "This contains the complete technical review of the 1982 incident, including the suppressed testimony from your team members. It vindicates you completely." He slid the folder across the table to Tom, who made no move to touch it. "Sarah Winters submitted a detailed statement describing how you warned about the cooling system incompatibility," Anderson continued. "James Harper confirmed that the project manager overruled your recommendation to postpone the demonstration. Even Colonel Matthews, before he passed away, left a sealed deposition stating that political pressure from Westland Technologies led to your scapegoating." Tom's expression remained carefully controlled, but Lisa could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight increase in his breathing rate. This moment, this vindication, was what he had been denied for 4 decades. "The engine you examined yesterday is built on principles you helped develop over 40 years ago," Anderson said. "The mounting dampers you flagged as faulty were originally designed using your own specifications. Specifications that were altered after you were removed from the project, leading to the exact problem you warned about, then repeating itself now." The general leaned back in his chair, his expression somber. "Captain Walker, may I ask why one of the architects of the military hybrid propulsion program, who just saved a multi-million-dollar project, is working outside our military system, fixing farm equipment in Arizona?" Tom met Anderson's gaze directly. "You know why, General? There was an accident during testing back in '82. I was blamed for it and ended up with a permanent injury to my leg. After that, they saw me as a liability." "I understand," Anderson said quietly, "but that was then. This is now. Times have changed, and so has military leadership." He straightened in his chair. "Captain Walker, I would like to make you an offer." "I'm listening," Tom replied cautiously. "We have other projects facing serious issues. The next generation of military vehicles, power systems for forward operating bases, emergency response equipment, all of them could benefit from your expertise. Anderson leaned forward, his expression earnest. I'm offering you a position as Special Technical Advisor to the Joint Chiefs reporting directly to me. Full restoration of your security clearance, access to any facility you need, and compensation commensurate with your expertise and experience. The offer hung in the air between them, not just a job, but a complete restoration of Tom's professional standing, a public acknowledgement of his contributions, and a chance to reclaim the legacy that had been stolen from him. Tom was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. General, I appreciate the offer, I really do. Anderson waited, sensing there was more coming. But that chapter is behind me now, Tom continued. That's not who I am anymore. Lisa couldn't hide her surprise. After everything Tom had lost, after finally receiving validation of his work, she had expected him to embrace this opportunity for restoration. Anderson seemed equally taken aback, though he masked it quickly with military discipline. I respect your decision, Captain, the general said after a moment. But allow me to make one more proposal. He pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. This is to cover the service you provided yesterday and the recognition you should have received years ago. Tom didn't take it right away. He just looked at the folded paper, then at the general's outstretched hand. I didn't do it for that, sir. I know, Anderson replied, his voice softening. That's exactly why you deserve more than what's in this envelope. Tom finally accepted it and slid it into the pocket of his worn jacket without opening it. He rose slowly from his chair, clearly signaling the end of the meeting. Is there nothing I can say to change your mind about the advisor position? Anderson asked, standing as well. Tom looked thoughtful. After 40 years of being forgotten, General, I've learned to value my peace. I fix tractors now. Simple machines with honest problems. At the end of the day, I can see the results of my work in a farmer's grateful face. It's enough. Anderson nodded, a flicker of regret crossing his features. The offer remains open should you reconsider. As Tom turned to leave, Anderson spoke again. One last thing, Captain. There's someone else who would like to speak with you before you go, someone who's been waiting a very long time for this opportunity. Tom raised an eyebrow in question. Sarah Winters, Anderson replied. She's here on base. She drove down from Maryland as soon as she heard you had been located. A complex wave of emotions crossed Tom's face, surprise, apprehension, and something deeper that even his military discipline couldn't fully conceal. Sarah had been more than just a colleague. For the accident, before everything fell apart, there had been possibilities between them, possibilities that evaporated when his career and reputation were destroyed. She's waiting in the conference room down the hall, Anderson added gently. Tom looked at Lisa, who nodded encouragingly. With a deep breath, he turned toward the door. His steps measured his back straight, despite the pain in his leg. As he reached for the handle, Anderson called after him. Walker. Tom paused, looking back at the general. Thank you, Anderson said simply. Not just for yesterday, for Pork Chop Hill. I never forgot what you did, even if the rest of the Army did. Tom acknowledged this with a slight nod, then stepped into the hallway, Lisa following close behind. They walked in silence toward the conference room. Tom's expression unreadable as he processed the dramatic turns this day had already taken. Outside the conference room door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Lisa touched his arm gently. My grandfather always said you were the bravest man he ever met, she said quietly. This kind of courage might be different from running into enemy fire, but it's no less real. Tom looked at her, seeing echoes of his old friend in her supportive smile. He squared his shoulders and opened the door. The woman who rose from the conference table had aged since he'd last seen her, just as he had. Silver had replaced the auburn in her hair, and time had etched its inevitable lines on her face. But her eyes, those remarkable green eyes that had once lit up with excitement over breakthrough calculations, remained unchanged. They widened now as she took in the sight of him, standing in the doorway after 40 years of absence. Tom, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You came back. The next morning found Tom back at Farmer Jennings' property, completing the hydraulic cylinder adjustment on the John Deere tractor he had abandoned the previous day. The familiar work soothed him after the emotional turbulence of his return to the military world. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, his mind calm, despite the revelations and encounters that had upended his carefully constructed isolation. He heard tires on the dirt road and looked up, half expecting to see Lisa Mitchell's black SUV returning. Instead, a silver sedan pulled into the yard, kicking up dust that caught the morning sunlight in golden swirls. Dr. Phillips stepped out, looking oddly out of place in his pressed slacks and button-down shirt amid the rural farm setting. The young engineer approached hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by a humbled demeanor that seemed unfamiliar to him. He leaned against the car's bumper, squinting in the bright morning sun. "Mr. Walker," he began, "I had to come here and tell you something in person, if I may." Tom wiped his hands on a rag, regarding the younger man with calm attention. "Of course, Doctor." Phillips took a deep breath. "When you identified that micro vibration yesterday, I felt small. Small because I've always seen myself as very smart, maybe even better than others. But clearly I was wrong." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon, as if encompassing the world beyond the farm. "I've spent years surrounded by experts, PhDs, engineers, young minds with shining diplomas on the wall. But none of them had the sensitivity you showed in that hangar. You heard something no one else could hear." Tom looked out toward the point where the desert met the sky. He picked up a rag and slowly wiped his hands, unhurried in his response. "Learning has everything to do with listening," he said finally, with humility. "Machines always give a warning when something's out of place, but not everyone has the patience to understand them or the humility to listen to someone who does." Phillips lowered his head, thoughtful. "The system is fully operational now. The modifications you suggested work perfectly. General Anderson has authorized full production to resume." He hesitated before adding, "They're calling it the Walker-Phillips mounting system in the updated specifications." Tom raised an eyebrow at this unexpected information. "I insisted your name come first," Phillips clarified. "It was your insight that solved the problem. I just implemented the solution." He took a deep breath, then reached out and shook Tom's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. Not just for fixing our engine, but for teaching me something about engineering and about myself." As Phillips drove away down the dirt road, his sedan gradually disappearing in a cloud of dust, Tom Walker stood watching. There he remained between two worlds, carrying within himself the quiet proof that a person's true worth is never lost. It simply waits for the right moment to be rediscovered by those wise enough to look beyond appearances with humility. The unopened envelope from General Anderson remained in Tom's pocket, its contents yet to be examined. Beside it was a business card with Sarah Winter's current contact information passed to him after an emotional reunion that had opened doors Tom had believed forever closed. And on his wrist, the ancient Timex continued its steady rhythm, marking the passage of time that had finally, after 40 years, begun to heal old wounds. Tom turned back to the tractor, his hands finding their familiar places on the tools he had used for decades. But as he worked, something had shifted in his perspective, a subtle change in how he viewed his past, his present, and the possibilities that might yet lie before him. 2 days passed in the familiar rhythm of rural Arizona life. Tom rose at 5 each morning, brewed his black coffee, and read the newspaper before heading out to repair whatever machinery awaited his attention. To any observer, nothing had changed. The elderly mechanic, with a slight limp in his right leg, continued his solitary routine, speaking little, working steadily, his weathered hands bringing broken things back to life with practiced efficiency. But beneath this outward constancy, Tom's mind was in turmoil. The unopened envelope from General Anderson sat on his small kitchen table, its presence a constant reminder of the past that had suddenly, unexpectedly reached forward to reclaim him. Beside it lay Sarah Winter's business card, the neat handwriting on the back, "It's never too late, Tom," carrying implications that both unsettled and intrigued him. Throughout his workday, snippets of memory from his encounter with Sarah kept surfacing. When they'd met in that conference room and after 40 years apart, the shock of recognition had nearly overwhelmed him. She had aged, of course, as he had, but her eyes, those remarkable green eyes that had once lit up with excitement over breakthrough calculations, remained unchanged. And despite the silver hair and the lines time had etched onto her face, he'd noticed something else, the subtle stiffness in her movements, a legacy of the spinal injuries she'd suffered in the explosion that had derailed both their lives. Their conversation had been tentative at first, weighted with 4 decades of silence. I tried to find you, she had told him, her voice carrying a hint of the pain she'd endured. After I recovered enough to leave the hospital, they wouldn't tell me where you'd gone. Would it have mattered? Tom had asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. It would have to me, she had answered simply. They had talked for an hour, catching up on the broad strokes of lives lived separately. Her academic career, teaching engineering, physics at a community college in Maryland. Her brief marriage that hadn't lasted, her ongoing physical therapy to maintain mobility despite her injured spine. She had kept track of the Walker principle through scientific journals, she told him, always knowing it was his work even when others had forgotten. Now on the third morning after his return from Fort Campbell, as dawn painted the desert landscape in hues of amber and gold, Tom found himself standing before his small bathroom mirror, studying the FaceTime had carved from the young captain he once was. The lined countenance that stared back at him seemed to ask silent questions. Who are you now? What remains of the man you were? What might still be possible? The telephone rang, an unusual occurrence at this early hour. Tom answered with his customary brevity. Walker. Captain Walker, came Lisa Mitchell's voice, vibrant despite the static on the rural connection. I'm calling with news you should hear. Go ahead, Lieutenant. The MX-7 Phantom completed a full 4-hour demonstration yesterday. Perfect performance. General Anderson has authorized full production. Tom allowed himself a small smile. Good. Dr. Ryan Phillips is a quick study. There's more, Lisa continued. The general announced the formation of a new advanced propulsion training center at Fort Campbell. He wants to call it the Walker Institute of Military Engineering. Tom's grip tightened on the receiver. I didn't agree to that. He's not asking permission, sir. It's happening with or without your involvement. But we would prefer it be with. Tom gazed out his small kitchen window at the desert sunrise, a sight he had grown to love during his years of exile. I've built a life here, Lieutenant. Have you? Lisa challenged gently. Or have you built a hiding place? The question hung between them, unanswered, but resonant with truth. After a moment, Louisa continued. There's a ceremony at the Pentagon next Friday. General Anderson will be announcing the Institute, informally acknowledging your contributions to military engineering. The Institute will have 3 divisions: research and development, educational training, and the Walker Mentorship Program, pairing experienced engineers with promising young talent. The Pentagon. Tom repeated the word, carrying decades of complex associations. A car will pick you up Thursday morning if you agree. First-class flight to D.C. arranged. Tom's free hand moved unconsciously to the Timex watch on his wrist. I'll think about it. One more thing, Lisa added. Dr. Winters has been appointed as the academic director for the new institute. Despite her spinal condition, she's insisted on taking a hands-on role with the students. She specifically requested that I mention that to you. After hanging up, Tom finally opened the envelope from General Anderson. Inside, he found a check for a sum so substantial it momentarily took his breath away, along with a formal letter on Pentagon letterhead. The letter acknowledged his invaluable contributions to military propulsion technology and offered sincere apologies for the historical misattribution of responsibility in the 1982 Project Phoenix incident. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that truly caught his attention. The young private you pulled from that burning tank on Porkchop Hill has spent 65 years trying to repay a debt. Please allow him this small measure of restitution. W.A. Official recognition after 40 years of silence. Financial compensation that would transform his modest existence. And Sarah, brilliant, passionate Sarah, back in his life with an unspoken question hanging between them. What might have been, what might still be. Tom folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. He had decisions to make, but first he had a tractor to fix for Farmer Jennings. Some commitments, however small, deserved to be honored before new ones could be undertaken. That night, an unexpected sound woke Tom from a fitful sleep, the distinctive rumble of a military helicopter passing overhead. He rose and walked to the window, watching as the aircraft's lights disappeared beyond the horizon. For the briefest moment, he was transported back, not to the laboratories of Project Phoenix, but to the chaos of Porkchop Hill, the acrid smell of burning fuel, the desperate faces of young soldiers depending on him to get that tank running again. The flashback passed quickly, but it left him shaken. This was something he hadn't considered about returning to military service. The old memories not just of professional triumph and betrayal, but of war itself. Could he face those ghosts while trying to build something new? Thursday morning found Tom standing beside his small travel bag at the end of the dirt road leading to his home. He wore his best clothes, a pressed, button-down shirt, clean dark jeans, and a navy blazer that had hung unworn in his closet for years. The outfit felt strange after decades of work clothes, a costume from another life. The sleek black town car that appeared precisely at the appointed time seemed equally out of place on the dusty Arizona road. A uniformed driver emerged, snapping to attention when he recognized Tom from the photograph he'd been given. "Captain Walker, I'm Sergeant Reynolds. It's an honor to meet you, sir." Tom nodded acknowledgement, uncomfortable with the formality. "Just Tom is fine, Sergeant." "Yes, sir. May I take your bag, sir?" As they drove toward Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, Tom watched the familiar landscape slip away, the desert he had come to think of as his sanctuary gradually giving way to suburbs, and eventually the urban sprawl of Phoenix. Each mile marked his transition from the simple life he had constructed back toward the complex world he had once navigated with such confidence. At the airport, Tom was surprised to find himself escorted past the usual security checkpoints to a private terminal where a military aircraft awaited. Lieutenant Mitchell stood at the foot of the boarding stairs, her uniform impeccable, her smile welcoming. "I thought this would be more comfortable than commercial captain," she explained. General Anderson insisted. The flight to Andrews Air Force Base passed in a blur of conflicting emotions for Tom. The military aircraft, while not luxurious, offered comforts he had long since ceased to expect: attentive service, decent food, respectful interactions. Yet he remained conscious of the contrast between this treatment and the decades of obscurity that had preceded it, the abrupt shift from forgotten veteran to honored guest. Lisa respected his need for reflection, engaging in conversation when he seemed receptive, but otherwise allowing him his privacy. It was only as they began their descent that she broached the subject foremost in both their minds. "Are you ready for tomorrow, Captain?" Tom gazed out the window at the Maryland landscape below. "I've had 40 years to prepare, Lieutenant, though I never expected this day would come." "My grandfather would be proud," she said. "He always believed you'd be vindicated someday." "Jimmy was an optimist," Tom replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "Always saw the best in people and situations. I was the opposite, always looking for what might go wrong." "That's why you made such a good team," Lisa observed. "He inspired people to reach for the impossible. You made sure they got there safely." The insight surprised Tom with its accuracy. "Your grandfather understood people. I understood machines. Together we managed not to get killed in Korea. Most of the time." Lisa hesitated, then asked, "Have you given any thought to what technology has become today? Things have changed dramatically since your time with Project Phoenix." Tom's expression grew thoughtful. "I've kept up with the basic developments: quantum computing, artificial intelligence, advanced materials. But I'm under no illusion that I can simply step back in without a significant learning curve." "Would that be a problem for you? Learning new systems, new tools?" Tom surprised her with a short laugh. "Lieutenant, I've been taking things apart and putting them back together since I was 7 years old. The principles don't change even when the technology does. Besides," he added, his voice softening, "there's something to be said for approaching new technology with old wisdom." A car waited for them at Andrews, another black town car with tinted windows and a uniformed driver who maintained a respectful silence as they traveled toward Washington, D.C. Tom watched the familiar landmarks pass by, the monuments and buildings that symbolized the nation he had served for so many years. They pulled up to a dignified hotel near the Pentagon, far more elegant than any accommodation Tom had experienced since his active duty days. As the bellhop took his modest bag, Lisa handed Tom a card key. "The ceremony begins at 1,000 hours tomorrow. A car will pick you up at 0900. Tom pocketed the key. "And tonight," Lisa smiled, "someone is waiting for you in the hotel restaurant. She thought you might appreciate a friendly face before tomorrow's formalities." Tom knew immediately who it would be. Despite his exhaustion from the journey, he felt a quickening of his pulse that had nothing to do with fatigue. "Thank you, Lieutenant." "Lisa," she corrected gently. "Outside of official functions, I think you've earned the right to use my first name." Tom nodded, a ghost of a smile crossing his features. Thank you, Lisa, for everything. Just fulfilling my grandfather's last request, she replied. He made me promise if I ever found you, I'd make sure you received the recognition you deserved. She checked her watch. I should go. The car will be here at 900 sharp. After she departed, Tom took the elevator to his room, a spacious suite with views of the Washington Monument in the distance. He placed his bag on the luggage rack, removed his blazer, and stood for a moment taking in surroundings so different from his modest Arizona home. Then with a deep breath, he headed back downstairs to the restaurant. Sarah Winters sat at a corner table, a glass of white wine untouched before her. The decades had been kind to her. Her silver hair was styled elegantly, and her posture remained as straight and confident as it had been during their days on Project Phoenix, though he noticed she sat with the careful positioning of someone managing chronic pain. As Tom approached, she looked up, and those remarkable green eyes locked with his. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said as he took the seat opposite her. To dinner or to Washington? Either, both. Sarah studied his face. You've changed, Tom, and yet not at all. 40 years will do that. He signaled a waiter and ordered a black coffee. Congratulations on your appointment at the new institute. Sarah smiled, though a shadow passed behind her eyes. A bittersweet honor. I should have been working alongside you all these years. We can't change the past, Tom said, his voice gentle but firm. No, but we can acknowledge it. Sarah reached across the table, briefly touching his hand before withdrawing. I've thought of you often, Tom, wondered where you were, what you were doing. After the accident when they reassigned you, I tried to speak up. I know. Anderson showed me your statement. It didn't help, she said, regret evident in her tone. It helps now, Tom replied. Knowing someone tried to tell the truth, it matters. Their conversation flowed more easily after that, skipping between present circumstances and shared memories, carefully navigating around the deeper currents of what might have been. They spoke of colleagues from the old days, those who had passed on, those who had thrived, those who had simply disappeared into ordinary lives. They discussed the technological advances that had occurred in their field, Sarah bringing Tom up to date on developments he had followed only distantly during his years in Arizona. The engineering students today, Sarah said, shaking her head with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. They're brilliant with theory and computation, but many of them have never taken apart a real engine with their hands. They design everything on computers without understanding the physical realities of what they're creating. That's where the Walker Mentorship Program comes in, Tom suggested. Sarah smiled. So you've heard about that. Are you considering it? I'm here, aren't I? Yes, but are you really here, Tom? Or are you just going through the motions to be polite? The directness of her question caught him off guard. Before he could formulate a response, she continued, I've spent 40 years teaching young engineers, trying to instill in them the principles you taught me. The importance of listening to the machines, of understanding systems holistically, not just as collections of parts. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Imagine what you could do with these students directly. The impact you could have on the next generation. As they finished their meal, Sarah's expression grew more serious. Have you thought about what you'll say tomorrow? The ceremony will be broadcast throughout the military engineering community. It's your chance to be heard after all this time. Tom had indeed been pondering this question throughout the journey east. I'm not looking for revenge or vindication, he said after a moment. Too late for that. Too many of the responsible parties are long gone. Then what do you want from tomorrow? Tom considered the question, his weathered fingers absently tracing the edge of his coffee cup. Recognition for the principles, not the man, he said finally. I want these young engineers to understand that technology without wisdom is just sophisticated foolishness. That listening, really listening to machines, to people, to experience, that's what makes innovation valuable. Sarah's eyes softened. That sounds like the Tom Walker I remember, always more concerned with getting it right than getting the credit. As they parted in the hotel lobby, Sarah hesitated, then stepped forward and embraced him briefly. Despite her efforts to hide it, Tom could feel the stiffness in her movements, the legacy of her injuries. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said. I'm glad you're here. It's been too long. Tom returned to his room with mixed emotions. The evening with Sarah had awakened memories and feelings long dormant, yet he remained uncertain about the path forward. The comfort of his solitary existence in Arizona called to him the simplicity of a life where expectations were few and disappointments fewer. Yet against that pull was the undeniable tug of possibility of purpose connection, and perhaps even a chance to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated by a new generation. He slept fitfully, his dreams a kaleidoscope of images from different chapters of his life. The chaos of Pork Chop Hill, the excitement of Project Phoenix, the devastation of the accident, the quiet dignity of his years fixing farm equipment. Through it all ran a sense of anticipation, as if his unconscious mind understood better than his waking self that tomorrow represented not just acknowledgement of the past, but a doorway to the future. The morning dawned clear and bright, the autumn sunshine casting long shadows across the nation's capital as Tom dressed for the ceremony. From his luggage, he removed a small wooden box he had brought from Arizona. Inside lay his military decorations, the Purple Heart Silver Star, and other recognitions of his service in Korea. He had not worn them in decades, but today seemed to call for this acknowledgement of his full history. As promised, the car arrived precisely at 0900. To Tom's surprise, General Anderson himself sat in the back seat. "I thought I'd accompany you this morning, Captain," the general said as Tom settled beside him. "Some journeys shouldn't be made alone." Up close, Tom could see that the years had marked William Anderson deeply. Now in his mid-80s, the general's face bore the inevitable lines of age, yet his eyes remained sharp and alert. Those eyes, Tom remembered them from 65 years ago, wide with fear and pain, as blood seeped through field bandages on Pork Chop Hill. They drove in companionable silence for several minutes, two men from the same generation who had followed vastly different trajectories, yet found themselves converging at this late stage of life. "Nervous?" Anderson asked finally. "Should I be?" Tom countered. Anderson smiled. "The Secretary of Defense will be present, the Joint Chiefs, representatives from every branch of the service. But no, Captain, you've faced worse than a room full of brass." "Pork Chop Hill," Tom agreed quietly. "We were both different men then," Anderson observed. "You were a young mechanic who ran toward danger rather than away from it. I was a terrified private convinced I was going to die on foreign soil." "We all were," Tom said. "Terrified, I mean. Anyone who claims otherwise is either lying or doesn't remember correctly." Anderson nodded, his expression reflective. "When they pulled me out of that tank, my leg torn up, enemy fire all around us, I made two promises to myself. First, that if I survived, I'd dedicate my life to serving the country that had asked for my sacrifice. Second, that I'd never forget the man who made my survival possible." He turned to look directly at Tom. "I kept the first promise. Today I've finally fulfilled the second." Something in his tone caught Tom's attention. "You knew where I was, didn't you, before Lisa Mitchell found me?" Anderson nodded slowly. "I've known for years, kept tabs on you through unofficial channels. Why didn't you reach out sooner?" The older man sighed. "Politics. The people who buried you had powerful friends. I tried twice to reopen your case, once in the 90s and again after I made 4-star. Both times I was blocked." His expression hardened. "But I'm retiring next month. They can't touch me now, and they can't touch you." The Pentagon's ceremonial auditorium was filled to capacity as Tom entered alongside General Anderson. Military personnel in dress uniforms, civilian officials in formal attire, and a contingent of engineering students, specially invited from military academies, all rose in unison as Tom walked down the center aisle. On the stage, a distinguished group awaited the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and in a seat of honor, Sarah Winters. Her smile of encouragement was like a beacon to Tom as he mounted the steps to the platform, noticing the subtle effort it took her to stand as he approached. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. General Anderson delivered a concise opening address outlining the historical significance of the Walker Principle and its impact on military technology over the past 4 decades. The Secretary of Defense followed with formal remarks about the importance of recognizing innovation and the debt owed to those whose contributions had been overlooked. Throughout these preliminaries, Tom sat quietly, his expression composed despite the emotional weight of the moment. He had not expected this level of recognition, had in fact spent decades convinced that his contributions would remain forever uncredited, his innovations attributed to others or to anonymous engineering principles, divorced from their human origin. When it came time for Tom to speak, a hush fell over the auditorium. He approached the podium slowly, conscious of his slight limp, but refusing to let it define his bearing. The polished wood gleamed beneath his weathered hands as he placed his prepared remarks before him. But as he looked out at the assembled faces, the high-ranking officers, the civilian officials, and especially the young engineering students in the front rows, Tom set aside his written speech. After 40 years of silence, formality seemed inadequate to the moment. In 1953, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. I learned that machines speak a language all their own. On Porkchop Hill, with artillery falling around us, I listened to a damaged tank engine and heard it telling me how to make it run again. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. In 1982, I heard another machine trying to warn us of danger. That time, people chose not to listen. The result was an explosion that injured good people and buried a technology that might have saved lives on battlefields around the world. Tom's hand moved unconsciously to the Purple Heart pinned to his jacket. I'm not here today to assign blame or seek personal vindication. Too many years have passed for that. I'm here to speak about something more important than one man's career or legacy. I'm here to talk about listening. The room remained utterly silent as he continued. Engineering isn't just about calculations and specifications. It's about understanding the language of materials and forces. It's about hearing the subtle harmonics of systems under stress. It's about respecting the wisdom embedded in experience. He turned slightly to address the young engineering students directly. You have advantage. My generation never dreamed of computational power simulation capabilities, materials we couldn't imagine. But technology alone isn't enough. You need to develop the ability to listen to the machines, yes, but also to the people who work with them every day. The mechanic who notices an unusual vibration. The operator who senses something isn't quite right. These voices matter as much as any algorithm or specification. Tom's gaze found Sarah in the audience, and something in his expression softened. I lost 40 years to pride, not mine, but the pride of those who couldn't admit a mistake had been made. Don't let that happen to you or to those who depend on your work. Be humble enough to listen, brave enough to speak up when something's wrong, and wise enough to recognize that good ideas can come from unexpected sources. He paused again, gathering himself for the conclusion. The institute being established today isn't really about me or my work. It's about creating a place where experience and innovation meet, where practical wisdom and theoretical knowledge strengthen each other. If it succeeds in that mission, then the past, with all its mistakes and missed opportunities, will have served a purpose worthy of the sacrifices made. As Tom stepped away from the podium, the applause began, not the polite acknowledgement of a ceremonial occasion, but a spontaneous growing wave of recognition. The Secretary of Defense approached, presenting Tom with the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, the highest honor the Department of Defense can bestow upon a civilian. In recognition of your groundbreaking contributions to military propulsion technology, the citation read, and your unwavering dedication to excellence despite institutional challenges. The formal language couldn't capture the enormity of the moment. A lifetime's work finally acknowledged, a reputation restored after decades of obscurity. Tom accepted the medal with quiet dignity, but it was the next presentation that truly moved him. General Anderson stepped forward, holding a simple wooden plaque. This will be mounted at the entrance to the Walker Institute of Military Engineering, he explained. We wanted your approval of the inscription. Tom read the words engraved on the polished brass plate, the Walker Institute of Military Engineering, dedicated to the principle that true innovation requires both technical excellence and the wisdom to listen. Every machine tells its story to those patient enough to hear. Captain Thomas Walker, U.S. Army. For the first time since the ceremony began, Tom's composed expression faltered. The quote words he had spoken to a young engineer decades ago had somehow survived the years of his exile, preserved and now elevated to a philosophical foundation for the institute bearing his name. It's perfect, he said quietly. The reception that followed was shorter than might have been expected for such an occasion, a consideration Tom suspected had been made for both his comfort and Sarah's. Still, he found himself approached by a steady stream of well-wishers, military officers, and civilian officials expressing admiration, sharing stories of how the Walker principle had influenced their work. Young engineering students asking earnest questions about his methodology and experiences. Through it all, Sarah remained nearby, a supportive presence as Tom navigated this unexpected return to prominence. During a brief lull in the conversations, she touched his arm gently. Overwhelming, she asked. Surreal, he admitted. Like attending my own funeral, except I'm inconveniently still alive. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying years of shared history. Always the pragmatist Tom, even in moments of triumph. Before he could respond, they were approached by a distinguished-looking man in civilian clothes accompanied by General Anderson. Captain Walker, Anderson said, may I present Dr. James Phillips, Director of Advanced Research at Westland Technologies. Tom stiffened imperceptibly at the company name Westland Technologies, the defense contractor that had orchestrated his downfall 40 years earlier. Dr. Phillips seemed to recognize Tom's reaction, his expression contrite. Captain Walker, I've looked forward to this meeting for many years, he said, extending his hand. My father worked for Westland during the Project Phoenix incident. Richard Phillips. I remember, Tom said, neutrally accepting the handshake despite his reservations. Richard Phillips had been one of the executives who had pushed for Tom to be blamed for the explosion. My father regretted his role in what happened to you, Dr. Phillips continued. Before he died, he asked me to make amends if I ever had the opportunity. He withdrew an envelope from his jacket pocket. These are the original design specifications for Project Phoenix, your designs with your name restored as lead engineer. Westland Technologies formally acknowledges your authorship and releases all proprietary claims to the Walker Principle. Tom accepted the envelope slowly, its weight in his hands, representing far more than paper and ink. Why now? Because it's the right thing to do, Phillips replied simply, and because we need your expertise for the next generation of hybrid propulsion systems. The MX-7 Phantom is just the beginning. We're developing technologies that could revolutionize not just military transport, but civilian applications as well. General Anderson nodded. Dr. Phillips has been instrumental in establishing the Walker Institute. Westland Technologies is the primary corporate sponsor. And what about Dr. Ryan Phillips? Tom asked. The project director at Fort Campbell. My cousin James Phillips clarified. He's been appointed head of the research division at the Institute, pending your approval, of course. He speaks very highly of your diagnostic abilities. Tom looked from Phillips to Anderson, then to Sarah, whose expression conveyed both support and understanding that this decision was his alone to make. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Westland, which had orchestrated his professional destruction, now offering restoration and opportunity. The military, which had allowed his scapegoating, now honoring his contributions. And Sarah, who had tried to defend him then and was present to witness his vindication now. I'll need to review these documents carefully, Tom said, finally indicating the envelope. And I'd want any collaboration to include complete technical transparency. Of course, Phillips agreed readily. We've established an advisory board for the Institute that includes representation from academia, military, and industry. Dr. Winters has already agreed to serve as academic director. We hope you'll consider joining as technical director emeritus. The title emeritus acknowledged both his seniority and the years taken from his professional life. Tom found himself appreciating the thoughtfulness of the gesture. I'll consider it, he said, more open to the possibility than he would have believed possible days earlier. As the reception continued around them, Tom and Sarah found a quiet moment together near a window overlooking the Pentagon courtyard. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the geometric precision of the world's largest office building, a fitting metaphor, Tom thought, for how institutional structures could simultaneously create order and obscure truth. What are you thinking? Sarah asked, studying his profile. That life takes unexpected turns, Tom replied. 6 days ago, I was fixing a hydraulic cylinder on Farmer Jennings' tractor. Now I'm being offered a position directing research that could affect national security. Sarah smiled. Quite a week. Indeed. Tom turned to face her fully. What would you do if you were me? I can't answer that, she said gently. But I can tell you what I hope you'll do, which is accept the position, work with me at the Institute. Use these years we have left to make sure the next generation learns from both our successes and our failures. Her hand found his, a brief touch of connection. Create a legacy that extends beyond principles and patents to the people who will carry our work forward. Tom was silent for a moment, weighing the comfort of his solitary existence against the purpose and connection being offered here. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by Lisa Mitchell approaching with an elderly man Tom didn't immediately recognize. "Captain Walker," Lisa said, "there's someone who's been waiting a long time to speak with you." The elderly man stepped forward, his bearing unmistakably military, despite his civilian clothes and the cane he leaned upon. "Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, sir. In Infantry Division, Pork Chop Hill." Tom's expression transformed as recognition dawned. "Rodriguez, you were driving the tank." "Yes, sir." Rodriguez's weathered face broke into a smile. 65 years, and I never forgot what you did that day. When I heard about this ceremony on the news this morning, I called my granddaughter to drive me here." He gestured to a young woman standing respectfully nearby. "Had to see for myself that Captain Thomas Walker was finally getting his due." For the first time that day, Tom embraced someone spontaneously clasping Rodriguez's shoulder with genuine emotion. "I thought everyone from that day was gone." "Not all of us, sir. There's a few of us old soldiers still kicking around, and we remember." Rodriguez straightened as much as his aged frame allowed, offering a formal salute. "It's been an honor, Captain, then and now." As Rodriguez moved away, aided by his granddaughter, Tom found himself at a crossroads more profound than any he had faced since the aftermath of the Project Phoenix disaster. The path back to Arizona offered solitude, simplicity, the comfort of familiar routine. The path forward into this new role promised purpose, connection, perhaps even a measure of fulfillment that had been absent from his life for decades. "I need some air," he said to Sarah and Lisa. "Excuse me for a moment." Outside the Pentagon, Tom stood in the crisp autumn air, his thoughts as turbulent as the fallen leaves swirling around him in the breeze. He removed the ancient Timex from his wrist, studying the inscription that had guided him through war and peace, triumph and exile. "Hear the call of time." Jimmy Mitchell had given him this watch, believing Tom had a special gift for listening to machines, yes, but perhaps to something more. The rhythm of time itself, the subtle harmonies of a life properly lived. For 40 years, Tom had listened primarily to the past, the echoes of injustice, the phantom pain of opportunities lost. Now standing outside the massive structure that symbolized the military establishment that had both made and broken him, he found himself listening to the future. It called to him not with promises of glory or vindication, but with something far more compelling, the opportunity to ensure that the lessons of his life served purposes beyond his own experience. The chance to work alongside Sarah, whose presence in his life again seemed like a gift he had never expected to receive. The possibility of helping young engineers learn what couldn't be taught in classrooms or textbooks. Tom slipped the watch back onto his wrist just as General Anderson emerged from the building. "Taking a breather from the attention, Captain." Tom nodded. "It's a lot to process after 40 years of obscurity." "Understandable." Anderson came to stand beside him, both men gazing across the vast Pentagon grounds. "Have you decided about the Institute position?" Tom was quiet for a moment, measuring his words carefully. "When I was young, General, I believed that talent and dedication were enough, that if you did good work and served honorably, recognition would follow naturally." "Life taught us both otherwise," Anderson acknowledged. "Yes, but today has shown me something else, that while justice may be delayed, sometimes it does arrive even when you've stopped expecting it." Tom turned to face the general directly. "I spent too many years focused on what was taken from me. Perhaps it's time to concentrate on what I can still give." Anderson smiled, understanding the decision implicit in Tom's words. "The Institute will benefit enormously from your leadership, Captain, and I suspect you may find some healing in the process." "Perhaps." Tom's expression remained thoughtful. "On one condition." "Name it." "The Institute needs to prioritize mentorship, pairing experienced engineers with young talent. Too often, wisdom dies with the individual because no one bothered to listen while they were still here to teach." Anderson nodded. "Consider it done. We've established the Walker Mentorship Program as a core element of the Institute's mission." As they walked back toward the building, Tom felt a weight lifting, not completely, for some burdens become part of one's very structure over time, but enough to stand straighter, to breathe more fully, to contemplate a future different from the circumscribed existence he had accepted as his due. Inside, Sarah waited near the entrance, her expression questioning as Tom approached. He answered with a simple nod, and her face illuminated with a smile that bridged the 40 years of separation as if they were nothing more than a momentary interruption. "We should celebrate," she said. "There's a restaurant near my apartment in Maryland. Nothing fancy, but they serve honest food and respect privacy." "Sounds perfect," Tom replied, surprised at how natural it felt to make plans that extended beyond his solitary routines. As they prepared to leave, Lisa Mitchell approached one final time carrying a small package. "Before you go, Captain, my grandfather left this for you. He asked that I give it to you if I ever found you receiving the recognition you deserved." Tom accepted the package with surprise. Inside was a letter in Jimmy Mitchell's handwriting, dated just weeks before his death, and a small box containing a brand new Timex watch, almost identical to the ancient one Tom still wore. The letter was brief but heartfelt. "Tom, if you're reading this, Lisa found you in the military finally acknowledge what I always knew, that you were the finest engineer and the most honorable man I ever served with. The old watch I gave you has served its purpose, marking time until justice caught up with you. This new one is for whatever time remains. May it measure moments of purpose and perhaps even joy. Your friend always, Jim." Tom stood motionless, the letter in one hand, the new watch in the other, symbols of a friendship that had spanned a lifetime and now reached beyond death itself. With careful movements, he removed the ancient Timex from his wrist and placed it in his pocket, a treasured relic of the past. The new watch he fastened in its place, a symbol of possibilities yet to come. "Your grandfather," he said to Lisa, his voice thick with emotion, "was the wisest man I ever knew." 3 months later, the Walker Institute of Military Engineering was taking shape at Fort Campbell. Construction crews worked steadily on the new educational wing, while the research facilities were already operational in converted buildings. Tom had divided his time between Arizona and Kentucky, gradually transitioning from his old life to his new responsibilities, finding a balance that respected both his need for solitude and his commitment to the Institute's mission. The challenges had been considerable. At 78, mastering new technologies required more effort than it once had. There had been moments of frustration as he struggled with advanced computer systems, holographic interfaces, and the dizzying array of digital tools that modern engineers took for granted. But Tom approached these challenges with the same methodical patience he brought to mechanical problems, breaking each new technology down to its essential functions, understanding its purpose before worrying about its operation. What surprised him most was how quickly the younger engineers responded to his mentorship approach. Despite the generational gap and the initial skepticism some had shown, they seemed hungry for the kind of practical wisdom he offered, a counterbalance to their theoretical education. His ability to diagnose problems through direct sensory observation fascinated them, and many began to develop their own versions of his listening techniques, integrating them with modern diagnostic tools. Today, Tom stood in the partially completed main hall of the Institute, reviewing architectural plans with Sarah Winters. Their working relationship had evolved naturally over the months, built on mutual respect and the shared goal of creating something meaningful from the ruins of their past collaboration. Their personal relationship had developed more cautiously: weekly dinners, long conversations about everything except the feelings growing between them, a careful dance of two people who had learned the hard cost of hasty decisions. "The simulation lab will be ready next week," Sarah said, pointing to the blueprints. "Ryan Phillips has been testing the new vibration analysis system. He says it can detect micro oscillations we couldn't have measured in our day." "Good," Tom nodded, "but I still want the students to learn to use mechanical stethoscopes first. They need to train their ears before they trust the computers." Sarah smiled at his stubbornness. "Already arranged. I've ordered 24 of them, old-school models, just like yours." As they continued discussing the plans, a young woman approached Jessica Williams, a recent MIT graduate with exceptional theoretical skills but limited practical experience. She had been one of the first students accepted into the Walker Mentorship Program. "Excuse me, Dr. Walker, Dr. Winters," she said, her expression troubled. "I've been working with the thermal expansion models for the new composite mounting system, and something doesn't add up." Tom gave her his full attention. "Show me." Jessica led them to her workstation, where complex three-dimensional models rotated on multiple screens. "The simulation says this design should work perfectly, but when I built the physical prototype," she gestured to a small model on her desk, "it fails every time once it reaches operating temperature." Tom smiled, exchanging a glance with Sarah. And what does that tell you, Jessica? The young woman frowned in concentration. That the simulation isn't accounting for something in the real world, but I've checked all the variables a dozen times. Perhaps it's time to stop looking at the screen, Tom suggested gently, and start listening to the prototype. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, mechanical stethoscope, not his old one, but a new model designed to his specifications. Try this. Sometimes the machine knows what's wrong better than the computer does. As Jessica took the instrument with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, Tom felt a sense of profound satisfaction. This was why he had accepted the position not for vindication or recognition, but for moments like this. Moments when wisdom earned through decades of experience could be passed to a new generation, ensuring that the lessons of the past would shape the innovations of the future. Later that evening, as Tom and Sarah walked slowly around the perimeter of the base, enjoying the mild spring weather, she asked the question that had been on both their minds. Any regrets about accepting the position? Tom considered this carefully. About the Institute gnome, about leaving Arizona, he smiled slightly. I miss the desert sunrises and the simplicity. You could go back, Sarah said, her tone carefully neutral. The Institute is established now. It would continue without your daily presence. Tom stopped walking and turned to face her. Is that what you want? I want you to be where you belong, Tom. She held his gaze steadily. Wherever that is. He looked toward the Institute buildings in the distance, then back to Sarah. I spent 40 years listening to machines because they were easier to understand than people, safer to trust than people. He took her hand gently in his. Maybe it's time I learned to listen to something else, Mom. Sarah's smile held decades of patience finally rewarded. That sounds like a worthy project for your retirement years, Captain Walker. I'm thinking it might take the rest of my life, he replied softly. As they resumed their walk, Tom was conscious of Jimmy Mitchell's new watch on his wrist, marking moments that once would have seemed impossible. Ahead lay challenges he had never expected to face again, adapting to new technologies, mentoring young minds, building relationships long deferred. Behind lay decades of solitude not forgotten, but increasingly balanced by present purpose and future possibility. Thomas Walker had spent 40 years listening to the ghosts of the past. Now as he walked beside Sarah toward a future neither of them had anticipated, he found himself listening to something else entirely, the quiet rhythm of possibility, the steady cadence of redemption, and perhaps most surprisingly of all, the gentle harmony of joy, rediscovered late but cherished all the more for its unexpected arrival.